ಓಕೆ, ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮ ನಮ್ಮ ಆಯೋಜಕರಾದಂಥ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಪ್ರದೀಪ್ ಅವರು ಬೇರೆ ಕಾರ್ಯದ ನಿಮಿತ್ತ ಅವರು ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಇವತ್ತು ಈ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮವನ್ನು ನಿತೀಶ್ ಅವರ ನೆರವಿನೊಂದಿಗೆ ನಡೆಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ಮೊಟ್ಟ ಮೊದಲು ತಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಸ್ವಾಗತವನ್ನ ಕೋರುತ್ತಾ ಈ ಒಂದು ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮದ ಅಂತರ್ಜಾಲದ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಕ್ಕೆ ತಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಹೃತ್ಪೂರ್ವಕವಾಗಿ ಸ್ವಾಗತಿಸುತ್ತೇನೆ. ಇಂದಿನ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮದ ನಡೆಸಿಕೊಡುವವರು ಮುಖ್ಯ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸಕರಾಗಿ ನಮ್ಮ ನೆಚ್ಚಿನ ಇತಿಹಾಸಕಾರರಂತ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಮಾಲಿನಿ ಅಡಿಗ ಅವರು ನಮ್ಮೊಂದಿಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರು ಒಬ್ಬ ಪ್ರತಿಭಾವಂತ ಇತಿಹಾಸಕಾರರು. ಮೇಡಮ್ ಅವರು ಮೂಲತಃ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಕುಂದಾಪುರದವರಾಗಿದ್ದು ಈಗ ಕುಂದಾಪುರದಲ್ಲಿ ವಾಸವಾಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರ ಮುಖ್ಯ ವಿದ್ಯಾಭ್ಯಾಸ ದೆಹಲಿಯ ಲೇಡಿ ಶ್ರೀರಾಮ್ ಕಾಲೇಜ್ನಲ್ಲಿ, ನಂತರ ಜವಾಹರ್ಲಾಲ್ ನೆಹರು ವಿಶ್ವವಿದ್ಯಾಲಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೈಗೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇವರು ತಮ್ಮ ಬರಹಗಳಿಂದ ನಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಪರಿಚಿತರಾದರು. ಇವರ ಡಾಕ್ಟರೇಟ್ ಕೃತಿಯಾದಂಥ ಮಧ್ಯಕಾಲೀನ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತ ಕೃತಿಯು ಓರಿಯೆಂಟಲ್ ಬ್ಲ್ಯಾಕ್ ಸ್ವಾನ್ ಪಬ್ಲಿಕೇಶನ್ ಪ್ರಕಟಣೆಯವರು 2006ರಲ್ಲಿ ದ ಮೇಕಿಂಗ್ ಆಫ್ ಸದರ್ನ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ, ಪಾಲಿಟಿ ಅಂಡ್ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಇನ್ ಅರ್ಲಿ ಮಿಡಿವಲ್ ಪೀರಿಯಡ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ 400 AD to 1030 AD ಎಂಬ ಶೀರ್ಷಿಕೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಕಟಪಡಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇದು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾದಂಥ ಮಧ್ಯಕಾಲೀನ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಇತಿಹಾಸ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾದಂಥ ಕೃತಿ ಅಂತ ನಾನು ಹೇಳಬಯಸುತ್ತೇನೆ. ಈ ಕೃತಿಯು ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಾಚೀನ ಸಮಾಜ ರೂಪುಗೊಳ್ಳುವ ಪ್ರಕ್ರಿಯೆಯನ್ನು ಕಟ್ಟಿಕೊಡುತ್ತದೆ. ಸಾಹಿತ್ಯ ಹಾಗೂ ಶಿಲಾಶಾಸನಗಳನ್ನು ಆಧರಿಸಿ ಪ್ರಾಚೀನ ತಲಕಾಡಿನ ಗಂಗರು, ನೊಳಂಬರು, ಚೋಳರ ಕಾಲದ ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ಸ್ಥಿತ್ಯಂತರಗಳನ್ನು ಈ ಕೃತಿಯು ವಿವರಿಸುತ್ತದೆ. ಇದರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಅವರ ನಿರಂತರವಾಗಿ ಸಂಶೋಧನಾ ಕೃತಿಗಳು ಅಲ್ಲದೆ ಅನೇಕ ಲೇಖನಗಳು ಹೆಸರಾಂತ ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ಸಂಶೋಧನಾ ಕೃತಿಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಕಟವಾಗಿದೆ. ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಭಾರತೀಯ ಇತಿಹಾಸ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ನ ವಾರ್ಷಿಕ ಸಮ್ಮೇಳನದಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರ ಪ್ರಬುದ್ಧವಾದಂಥ ಸಂಶೋಧನಾ ಲೇಖನಗಳು ನಿರಂತರವಾಗಿ ಪ್ರಕಟಗೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತಾ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾವೆ. ಅವುಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಗುರುತಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳುವಂಥದ್ದು ಕೆಲವೊಂದು ಲೇಖನಗಳೆಂದರೆ ಸತಿ ಅಂಡ್ ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಸ್ಯಾಕ್ರಿಫೈಸ್ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಭಾರತೀಯ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟಾರಿಕಲ್ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ನ ಪ್ರೊಸೀಡಿಂಗ್ಸ್ 2007ರಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಕಟವಾಗಿದೆ. ಹಾಗೆ 2007ರಲ್ಲಿ ಧರ್ಮಶಾಸ್ತ್ರ, ದ್ರಾವಿಡಿಯನ್ ಕಿನ್ಶಿಪ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಫಿಮೇಲ್ ಇನ್ಹೆರಿಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಇನ್ ಮಿಡಿವಲ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಅನ್ನುವ ಲೇಖನ ಕೂಡ ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಕಟವಾಗಿದೆ. 2014ರಲ್ಲಿ ವುಮೆನ್ ಅಬೌಟ್ ಅ ಟೌನ್, ಇಮೇಜಸ್ ಆಫ್ ವುಮೆನ್ ಇನ್ ಅರ್ಲಿ ಮಿಡಿವಲ್ ಕನ್ನಡ ಲಿಟರೇಚರ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಲೇಟ್ ಮಿಡಿವಲ್ ತುಳು ಪಡ್ಡದಾನ ಎಂಬ ಲೇಖನವನ್ನು ಕೂಡ 2014ರಲ್ಲಿ ಭಾರತ ಇತಿಹಾಸ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ನ ಪ್ರೊಸೀಡಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಕಟವಾಗಿದೆ. ಇವರ ಹಲವಾರು ಸಂಶೋಧನಾ ಲೇಖನಗಳು ಸಂಪಾದಿತ ಕೃತಿಗಳ ಅಧ್ಯಾಯಗಳಲ್ಲಾಗಿ ಪ್ರಕಟವಾಗಿವೆ. ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಇತ್ತೀಚೆಗೆ ಅವರು ಪ್ರಕಟವಾದಂಥ ಎವಲ್ಯೂಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಪೊಲಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಇನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಷನ್ಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಇನ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ 400 to 1300 ಅವರ ದೀರ್ಘವಾದ ಲೇಖನ, ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ರಾಧಿಕಾ ಶೇಷನ್ ಅವರು ಸಂಪಾದಿಸಿದಂಥ ರಿಸರ್ಚಿಂಗ್ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸಿಷನ್ ಇನ್ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ ಅನ್ನೋ ಕೃತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಕಟವಾಗಿದೆ. ಈ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಮಧ್ಯಕಾಲೀನ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಚರಿತ್ರೆಯ ಹೊಸ ಓದು ಹಾಗೂ ಬರವಣಿಗೆಯ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಲಿನಿ ಮೇಡಮ್ ಅವರ ಸಂಶೋಧನೆ ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಪ್ರಮುಖ ಪಾತ್ರ ವಹಿಸುತ್ತದೆ. ಇವರು ಭಾರತೀಯ ಇತಿಹಾಸ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ನ ಸದಸ್ಯರಾಗಿದ್ದು ಇವರ ಸಂಶೋಧನೆ ಹಾಗೂ ಸಾಧನೆಯನ್ನು ಗುರುತಿಸಿ 2021ರ ಭಾರತೀಯ ಇತಿಹಾಸ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ನ ಪ್ರಾಚೀನ ಗೋಷ್ಠಿಯ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರನ್ನಾಗಿ ನೇಮಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇಂದಿನ ಈ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮದಲ್ಲಿ ಅರಿವಿನ ನೀರಿಗೆ ಅಂತರ್ಜಾಲ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮದಲ್ಲಿ 30ನೇ ಸರಣಿಯ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸ ಸರಣಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕಿನ್ಶಿಪ್, ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿ ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಚರ್ ಅಂಡ್ ವುಮೆನ್ಸ್ ರೈಟ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಇನ್ಹೆರಿಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಇನ್ ಅರ್ಲಿ ಮಿಡಿವಲ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಅಥವಾ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಆರಂಭಿಕ ಮಧ್ಯಕಾಲೀನ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿನ ರಕ್ತ ಸಂಬಂಧ, ಕುಟುಂಬ ರಚನೆ ಹಾಗೂ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರ ಆನುವಂಶಿಕ ಹಕ್ಕುಗಳ ಕುರಿತು ವಿವೇಚನೆ ಎಂಬ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸವನ್ನ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನೀಡಲಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರಿಗೆ ಶುಭಾಶಯಗಳನ್ನು ಕೋರುತ್ತಾ ಹಾಗೆ ಈ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಕ್ಕೆ ಮಾಲಿನಿ ಮೇಡಮ್ ಅವರನ್ನು ಈ ಮೂಲಕ ಸ್ವಾಗತಿಸುತ್ತೇನೆ. ಹಾಗೆ ತಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನೆರೆದಂತೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ವಿದ್ವಾಂಸರಿಗೆ ಮತ್ತೊಮ್ಮೆ ಸ್ವಾಗತವನ್ನು ಕೋರಿ ಈ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮವನ್ನು ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸ ನೀಡಬೇಕಂತ ಕೇಳಿಕೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತೇನೆ ಮೇಡಮ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ. ಮೇಡಮ್.
Thank you.
Yes, madam.
Thank you. Can you start the screen?
Okay.
I'd like the PPT.
Okay, madam. Nitish sir.
1 second, sir. ಕೊಟ್ಟೆ.
So, shall I start anyway?
Yeah,
I mean, I'll
yeah,
give the
you can start.
introduction.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so what I've been doing since my PhD, which was basically on state and society, since then I've been working on women and women's rights of inheritance. And I've been trying to see how kinship and family structure and, Dravidian kinship, essentially using inscriptions for doing that. So we'll start first with the historiography of.
Yes, madam. Madam, PPT ಇದೆ madam.
Next one, ಬೇಕಿತ್ತು.
Okay, madam. I'll get it.
So I'll start with the, how this field of family and household and the study of the family and the household started, because I'm trying to place myself within that whole framework. So this actually dates back essentially to the 19th century, to the second half of the 19th century, when people were very influenced by the evolutionary theories of Darwin, and a kind of social evolutionary perspective was brought in by scholars like Morgan and Bachofen, and followed on from there by Frederick Engels, who in his Origin of Family and Private Property has followed up on Morgan in particular. So what they envisaged was that in the primeval period, in the very ancient past, ancient social past, we had matrilineal hordes, a large group which was undifferentiated, from within which a patriarchal structure emerged. And from that, then gradually as a result of industrialization, nuclear family units, particularly patriarchal nuclear family units, emerged out of the patriarchal joint family. And they were particularly influenced by, the study of Henry Sumner Maine on the Indian joint family, on the study of uh, Balkan Zadruga and others, similar large family structures which were being studied by ethnographers in this period. So this was the vision that they, had, and this was continued later also. I mean, even though exactly evolutionism was out of favor by the beginning of the 20th century, but there were certain features of the, view of how nuclear families were a modern thing, a result, and particularly and peculiarly suited to the industrial age. So because they were neo-local, meaning that they were not tied down to a particular area. So as and when there was a requirement of seeking a new job, the family could just relocate, whereas the earlier joint families were rooted to the land, to joint family estates, and so they were not mobile, they could not move out, they were not very flexible in that sense. So they considered Talcott Parsons and other structural functionalists who were ruling the roost in the early 20th century. They essentially thought that the nuclear family was a great product, and a great structure which was peculiarly adapted to the modern period, even though that whole evolution and the kind of progress kind of thing was not so much emphasized, but they did see the nuclear family as a very modern institution, and they considered that progress everywhere would imply a breakdown of joint families wherever they existed, and the evolution of and the growth of neo-local in the sense that it's not rooted to a particular place, it can move anywhere. In that sense, neo-local conjugal units, which were basically where family socialization, the children's socialization took place, feeding took place, social reproduction took place. So this was a unit of the same. Whereas in the earlier period, when you had joint families, you had a more, there were more primary units of production. They also owned means of production like land, or in artisanal families, whatever went with, the looms and things like that. And they were rooted in a in a particular place. So this was the kind of vision that the structural functionalists had. In contrast, you had scholars like Frederick Lepley, who actually considered it, who were romantic critics of the modern industrialization, and who considered that the new nuclear family units were unstable and it was leading to social dysfunction. So this was another view that was existing, and he actually romanticized, and his study was basically on the STEM family, where the father would, essentially hold the land. The property would go only to one heir. It wouldn't go to all the children. The other children would either not marry, or they would marry or move out of the family. They wouldn't have any property there. This actually existed in parts of France and Germany. This actually did exist. So you have this kind of, and it was romanticized as being a very socially stable unit. And he felt that, this was missing in the modern period, that was socially stable. Now the proletariat was in these very unstable family units. So this was another view. So you have romanticization of the joint family on the one hand, and you have the positing of the nuclear family as particularly a modern institution which came up with industrialization. Now, in the mid 20th century, particularly from the late 60s and early 70s, you had a group of scholars led by Peter Laslett in Cambridge University, who went into a very large-scale study, primarily of England and Britain and Western Europe, but they also had a few other countries like Russia, the Balkans. And they studied these countries, and they came to the conclusion that in Britain, at least from the 15th century, and he studied this on the basis of manorial censuses. That way, one envies the European historians. They are so rich in their, sources. They have censuses, manorial censuses that kept coming up over a long period of time. And from that, they could actually see how the household was conceived of, and how many persons it was composed of, and whether it continued, and what kind of developmental changes took place. Because and that is one thing that sociologists in the early 20th century emphasized, that families actually underwent developmental cycles along with the life cycle of the persons composing it. So you have a young couple marrying and setting up a home, then they have children, so then it'll expand a little, then the children grow up and they'll move out, and then again the family will shrink back to the conjugal unit. In joint families, you will, like the STEM families, you may have one family of the father and the mother will retire when the son and heir is old enough to marry. So they will be there in one part of the house, and then you'll have the heir and his wife and children living there. And then, the cycle does continue. So developmental cycles. So, Europeans, because of their, excellent documentary sources right from the medieval period onwards, where you have manorial censuses, have that advantage over us, that they can get a kind of developing picture of how the household was composed, how it changed over time. We are not that lucky. But anyway, on the basis of these manorial censuses, Laslett came to the conclusion that at least from the 15th century, Britain and parts of Western Europe, like Netherlands and northern France, they had a nuclear family composed of father, mother, and two children. The mean family size was around 4 or 5 maximum. So he said that actually it is not a product of modernity, of industrialization. This has been the case right from a very early period. And they kind of drew a line across Europe, the distinguishing between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe had serfdom right until the late 19th century. And so there the lords of the manor preferred to have their the families of the serfs to be in large units, where, there would be continuity of labor service for them. So there you have large families, multiple conjugal units within the same family, a father and 2 or more sons with their wives and children, all staying together. A family unit which may be as large as 10 or 12 people was standard So you have studies of Hungary, in Hungary you have Berkner has done a study of manner across the early 19th and the 18th century, late 18th century, where he has shown that there was a STEM family being predominant, and that was because the land there could not, the peasant holding, I mean, like a peasant is like our Gaudas or other groups of dominant peasant holders. They were not allowed to partition their land. So a peasant holding had to stay united. Could not be partitioned. What they usually did was to give money payments to the other children. So what Laplace said about French STEM families, that only one son married and other sons moved out without any share in the property, that doesn't happen in Hungary. In Hungary, other children do get a share. They do marry, they do move out, and they do get a share because their inheritance system was in allowing and in fact requiring that all children should get a share in the property, daughters as well as sons. So the other children would get, and one son or one daughter, depending on which children were preferred by the father, would be chosen as the heir, and they would stay in the house and they would reproduce. So the house continued, the land continued, the land could not be partitioned. So this was one this thing. So there again you have extended families where you have got more than one conjugal unit subsisting within the same household. So this was one thing. So the various features that determine the size of the family, the structure of the family, therefore in Europe, was either was one, the inheritance patterns of that period, or that area. The other would be serfdom, the labor requirements, or whatever the basic. There were certain parts in Europe, in France in particular, where the lord had this right to inherit the property of the serf in case the serf did not have any children residing with him. So in those areas where that right of escheat existed, the serfs made sure that one of their children would always be with them. So there are therefore various factors that really influence the structure of the family. So there was a wide variety. There were nuclear families in certain areas like Britain or northern France, where small holdings were partible. They were partible, and so they tended to be partitioned, and so small family units would exist. In other areas where STEM family, where the property could not be partitioned, there you have STEM families. And you have another variety in France also, in the Pyrenean region, in the Pyrenees, which is between France and Spain, where families, because the situation there was very hard and there was a shortage of labor, so there was a tendency for brothers or sisters, siblings, to kind of bond together and live together in large households. It was known as Frereche. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, but Frereche is how it is spelled, with diacritics over the E's. So these units also existed. So various factors determined how the family would be structured. Next, please. The next.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So in India, because we lack sources, we don't have the kind of documents. As I said, I always feel envious whenever I read a European scholar about how rich their sources are. Now we are comparatively more, limited in our sources. So one major source in our historiography, we have tended to look at how a household was conceived of, how a family and a household was conceived of in the normative literatures, in the Dharma Shastric literature. So we have scholars like Kumkum Roy and Jaya Tyagi, who have been, the major scholars. The major scholars who look up the study of, the household and the structure. So they have really given a lot of emphasis on how over time, from the period of the Dharma Sutras in the centuries BC to the Dharmashastras in the centuries CE. We have a growth, the change in a more, rigid view of how households are composed. Whereas in the earlier period, you have, Brahmanas, because these are basically, aimed at Brahmanas. They're more concerned with the Brahmana Varna than the others. But there's still a pointer to how families were conceived of. We, of course, don't know whether other groups tended to, adhere to these norms or not. But certainly, given the social position of the Brahmins at the apex of the whole social structure, it would seem, and that is something that I know from inscriptions also, there's a tendency to ape the structures and the customs of the upper groups, process that M.N. Srinivas famously called Sanskritization. So these are normative ones. So they look at how the earlier groups had, the earlier works, the Dharma Sutras, had allowed Brahmins to marry women from other varnas as well. But by the time you come to the Manu Dharma Shastra, because they concentrate more on the Manu Dharma Shastra, by the time you come to the Manu Dharma Shastra, the Manu Dharma Shastra, you have comparative, emphasis on marrying the Savarna and all other by marrying other wives are considered to be frowned upon, and they have a lower status. Their children's rights to inheritance, the wives of other varnas, the children born of wives of other varnas have lower rights of inheritance, have lesser rights of inheritance. So this is how, they show how it developed, how a wife was considered to be within the authority of the husband, and that right of the husband over the wife essentially derived from the fact that she was given in marriage as a dana to the husband by the father or the brother to a preferred groom, preferably Savarna. And so those who are married in the gift form, the first four forms of marriage, the Brahma, Arsha, and others, the four preferred forms, the wives who were married that way were given a higher status, and the wives who were married according to the Gandharva or Asura or other forms of marriage, which are definitely frowned upon. So the wives who were married on those forms of marriage were of a lower status within the household. Their children had fewer rights, whereas in the earlier in the Dharma Sutra literature, their children had as much right, or at least they had a larger share of property than Manu was willing to allow them. So they look at this change. They also look at how, by the time you come to the early medieval period, when society is expanding, when you have, a geographic expansion into the peripheries. So you have in the early medieval period, the Deccan and the South being settled in a very large way of states coming up all over in Bengal, in Kashmir, in the South. So in the commentarial literature, which comes up in the early medieval period, in the later Dharma Shastras, as well as in the commentaries, like, for instance, Medatiti's commentary on the Manu Dharma Shastra, or our own Mitakshara, based on the Yajnavalkya Dharma Shastra, these are much more liberal again. So what the more rigid picture that Manu presents gets more flexible again in the later medieval period, in the early medieval period. So you can see this. So they have studied how this flexibility does occur and how these regional societies, out of which these commentaries emerged, the social circumstances of those regional societies influence the people there, influence the interpretations of the commentaries. So this is one thing that they have shown, that even though we cannot very clearly get a very clear picture of change, but some pointers do exist. In addition to Jayatyagi and Kumkuro, you also have Professor Mahalakshmi, who has studied, in addition, looks at the Shastric sources, she also looks at didactic literature like the Tirukural, for instance, or the epic literature like the Shilapadigaram, or what was the other one? Anyway, so she looks at those as well, and she looks at how the family is conceived of in that. So this is how Indian literature has, in Indian historiography, has studied the households and the family structure. And primarily the impression that we get from, because these are primarily North Indian, primarily patriarchal, Brahminical literature. So we have an emphasis on joint family units based on land. So this is the predominant impression that we get. But when we look at, say, for instance, the Mitakshara, I find that in the Mitakshara, when I look at what the inscriptions show me about the inheritance patterns and what the Mitakshara is saying, in reaction to the earlier works, it is very clearly situated in the circumstances of that period. So, for instance, where Manu doesn't allow the basically says that this is not liked and promotes equal division among the brothers. This is one difference. The second difference is Manu was also against the Shudra sons inheriting. But on the other hand, you have so many inscriptions where the Tottinamaga, the slave son, born of he was allowed to inherit. So many inscriptions have that. And I think it is in reaction to that we have the Mitakshara saying that, they are allowed to inherit. They are allowed to inherit, and he gives them a tenth of the share, I think, more than a tenth, which, very grudgingly Manu allows the son of the Shudra. So he gives them, in fact, almost the entire thing if there are no other children. And he gives them a larger share, depending on the will of the father. So this is a change that has been brought about. So we can see how social change within these various regions will affect, the various people, the views that the commentaries have. Okay, next slide, please. The next slide, please.
Yes, madam. 1 second. Okay, madam.
So thank you, sir. So I'm looking at inscriptions as a source for building up family units. Now, this is because of the manner in which early medieval inscriptions in Karnataka are, structured, particularly from the 11th century. Now, from the 4th to the 9th century, what we have is basically only the royal genealogies being given, 9th or 10th century. But from the 11th century, we have a much larger picture being presented. And, like this inscriptions, which of course most of you would be knowing, they start off by describing, and there's a very close parallel with literature as well. So for instance, if you look at the earliest literary work we have in Karnataka, the Vaddaradne, so whenever any story, any ruler is introduced, he's first say, "Ee Jambu Dvipada, Bharata Khandada, ee Nadinalli, ee Podalalli anta prarambha agtade." So that is how they structured, and then they'll introduce the king and his family. Inscriptions similarly, particularly from the 11th century, seem very strongly influenced by that. And they also begin similarly. They don't, I think they don't have but they do have Bharatakanda, Karnata, Mandala, and then they will introduce that particular Nadu, the particular, smaller Nadu within that, because Karnataka, the Nadus have numerical suffixes attached to them. So you have larger and smaller ones. So you will start with, say, the Gangawadi 96,000, then you'll go into Ganga 6,000, or, and smaller units like that. So for each, you have rulers ruling at each level. And so from the 11th century, you have a description of these units. Then you will have an introduction to the village in question after placing it in the Nadu unit that it belonged to, in the smaller unit it belonged to. You'll have a description of the unit, and then you'll have a description of the people ruling that village. It may be an Agrahara, in which case the Mahajanas will be eulogized, or it may be the Gaundas, in which case the Gaunda family particularly the Gowanda family in question, which is making the group to be introduced. So this is how the inscription, and you'll have at every level of the feudatory hierarchy, you have the genealogies being given. So you have genealogies of the king, you have genealogies of the Mahamandaleshwar, the Samanta, and then the Nadu Gowanda or whoever else, down the hierarchy, you have very often all of them being detailed. So we have a very rich corpus of inscriptions giving an impression of the family. Now, these are snapshots. These are not like the censuses where you can, discern the development of a unit. It's just a snapshot. It gives us an idea of what relations, the genealogy and the kinship pattern, what relations were considered significant by the people who lived in that period for that particular family, who are the people involved whom they want to give importance to. So I'll be going into that in greater detail a little later. So this is how it is structured. So inscriptions are therefore a fairly valuable source. I have found them pretty valuable in getting this thing, but we don't, unlike in Europe, get a household structure. We don't know how many people are members of that particular unit. All we get is which relationships, how the family, which are the relationships that are considered. So you've got various types in that. You've got some inscriptions where only the father, son, and son's son, the male line is detailed. You have others in which you've got the smaller units, where you've got the mother being introduced, the mother's family also being introduced, depending on how influential they are. So bilateral thing comes in there. So that kind of structure you have. And then sometimes the maternal uncles are mentioned. So, there are varied types of how the family is described. And lastly, you also have grants in which you get how the family, held property, whether they held it in common or they held it in conjugal union. That is one thing that you get from the grant portion of the inscription. When you have descriptions of purchase of land or granting of land, you have a clear picture of how the property was held. Or when grants are being made by individuals, how they, whether they do it all together or whether they, an individual does it. So all these are pictures that we get from inscriptions. Now, turning to the kinship system, particularly the Dravidian kinship system. Now, this is, you have to situate it in contrast to the North Indian kinship system, which we can deduce from the Dharmashastras as well as ethnography, because a lot of ethnographic work in North India has been done from the 19th and the 20th centuries. So it's basically, they have a patriarchal family structure where, you're not allowed to marry within close degrees of relationships. The Dharmashastras actually says 7 generations should not have common ancestors on the father's side for 7 generations, on the mother's side for 5 generations. However, that was very difficult to, find out. So what they normally did was that they shouldn't be related to the 4 grandparents of the bride and the groom. They shouldn't be a common relative. There shouldn't be a common gotra. So they should avoid the gotras of their paternal and grandfather and grandmother, as well as the maternal grandfather and grandmother. So that excluded a good deal of people. So, and invariably the bride always came from the outside. She had no connection with the family she was marrying into. Her connection with the natal family was almost entirely cut off. Only the brother coming occasionally, bringing gifts and such like. So she was in a totally alien setting. And also, you also have a very clear status differential between the wife takers and the wife givers. The people who are giving wives are considered inferior. So, if you know Hindi, you would know that Sala and Sasur are kind of abusers. Actually, it's your father-in-law and your brother-in-law, but you look down on them. So this shows the status differential that existed in the North Indian kinship structure. So that is one structure. Now, the Dravidian kinship, on the other hand, is based on a rule of cross-cousin marriage. At least the entire kinship terminology of the Dravidian kinship system, which would be all the 4 South Indian languages. Parts of Maharashtra follow the same. Some communities in Gujarat follow the same. I think some of the tribals of central India also have a Dravidian kind of kinship system. So it's a fairly widespread kinship system, and it is basically structured on the presumption that 2 cross cousins will marry. So whether they are cross cousins or not, that is how the kinship structures, kinship terminology is structured. And this was in fact an actual thing. It actually did happen back in the day, that you considered that you had a right over your maternal uncle's daughter. You have several stories in the, Vedara, the earliest work. I mean, going back to the 10th century, you have references to how a man considers himself by right is not respected and the girl is given to someone else, the girl and murders her. So, that kind of thing. So it was another story also. The parents say that they'll marry her to their cousins. But, so it was a thing. And even if you don't get a cousin, there are other variants of the Dravidian system where you marry the elder sister's daughter. That also exists in parts of Dharwad. I believe that's very common. So, you have variants, but what is common to the Dravidian kinship system is the fact that the bride and the groom will be selected from a close group, where you will prefer marrying into a family with whom you already have past relationships. So that is one very major thing that you have in South India, so that the girl almost invariably comes into a family she already knows. Her status is usually better, and there's no status differential between the girl's family and the husband's family. There's no status because you can give the girl in one generation, the next generation it may be returned. So you may have, the mother's brother being married in one generation, the father's sister. So, you have variants of that. And so what property goes on. So because of which the girl was also usually given a lot of property, because it was considered a matter of prestige to give your daughter in marriage, because you're giving within close degree. So it's a matter of prestige to give your daughter a good dowry when you're marrying her. So in South India, therefore, because it was, close, there was no status differential, because the girl usually went into families she already knew. The girl's rights to property were much greater than in Northern India. In Northern India, under the Dharmashastric rule, she only got, as a widow, she got a part of the property. As a daughter, she only got a quarter of what her brothers got, and only in the form of movable property. She didn't get immovable property. Whereas in the South, immovable property was also given. So this is one difference between the two systems. And because the girl was in a better position here, women tended to have better rights of inheritance in the Dravidian kinship system. The next slide, sir. Thank you. So, as I said, the Dravidian kinships therefore ensured a better right of inheritance for the women. So, and you can see that both in ethnography as well as in inscriptions, you got varying varieties of customary laws of inheritance where women were accommodated. So you have got bilateral inheritance. So a bilateral inheritance system is where the daughters inherit a part and the sons inherit a part. The daughter's portion is called dana and the son's portion is called mula, the mula, property. And we have that. We find these expressions in both both in inscriptions as well as in ethnography. One important, existing what has come down to us of customary rights of inheritance, customary code of inheritance, a bilateral code, is that of the Teshavarlamai of the Jaffna Tamils, which was written down in the late 19th century, where you have the property of the wife, which comes as a dowry, and the property of the husband, which comes as his share of the ancestral property, being pooled together in a conjugal fund of property. Then when the daughters get married, they get a portion, and it's usually a fairly good portion because, as I said, because the girl was usually married within close degrees, it was considered a matter of prestige. So it was not that she only got her mother's property, what her mother brought in. It was not that. Even ancestral property was sometimes drawn off. So she got her share. The sons had to wait till the parents died to divide what remained of the property, and that was their share. And we can see many inscriptions. I have several inscriptions from Shimoga where this expression of Hennige Danavagi and Gandige Moolavagi. This formula comes in several inscriptions. Even one, there's one inscription from Shimoga where, from the 11th century, if I recollect rightly, I forget the place, where a priest, a Loknatha Pandita, who was given lands, and the concluding part of the inscription says that ಈ ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹುಟ್ಟಿದ ಹೆಣ್ಣಿಗೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ಗಂಡಿಗೆ ಸಲ್ಲುವುದು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಂಡು ಆ ಚಂದ್ರಾರ್ಕ ತಾರಂಬರಂ ಸಲ್ಲುವುದು ಅಂತ. So it is to be divided among both the daughters and the sons. It's clearly specified, and this was probably a Brahmin family, so that is fairly significant. Another inscription comes from, I think, from the 16th century, from Bhatkal, if I recollect rightly, where again, the expression Hennige Dana Gandige Moola comes in. Shimoga also, a couple of inscriptions you have Hennige Dana Danavagi Vritti Kodudu, where she is given a particular living out of the income of which she can support herself, and the sons get a plot of land. So this you have in several inscriptions ranging from the 11th century down till the modern period. You have that. You have inscriptions, and so this was one very common form of inheritance, which seems to have been fairly widespread in southern India. The other one is the matrilineal property, which you can see even today in Kerala and in coastal Karnataka. And you could also, Ananta Krishna Iyer, in his study of the Mysore castes and tribes, mentions several groups like the Halepaikas, the Godigaras, who he says follow a matrilineal forms of inheritance in Shimoga. So it was not just in, like it may have survived today in the coastal regions, but it was fairly widespread because from the 11th century, from Chamarajnagar, I get a Tamil inscription which refers to a female lineage, Penvali Valiyaga, which Professor Veluthar described as a lineage traced in the female line. You also have an inscription of, I think, Bhairapura inscription from Mandya it was, where you have a lady called Rekave Dandanayakati. Now, interestingly, this lady gives land to her son-in-law, gives a plot of land as his inheritance to her son-in-law and daughter's daughter, and says that the property is to pass to her daughter and daughter's daughters. There's one daughter already existing and others. And Rekave herself, her husband is not mentioned anywhere. He's introduced in terms of her parents and her brother. So this is probably a matrilineal family where the husband was not important, and the property seems to pass in the female line. You've got similar instances. Of course, there it is more, it's more of a guesswork, where you have a father, brother, and sister grouping being mentioned in several inscriptions. In Chikmagalur also you have that, where brothers and sisters are mentioned, and the husband is not mentioned. The brother will be giving land in memory of his sister. So that kind of thing. So either the sister is not married, or it's the brother sister bond that is important. So you have that. You also have, I'll come to that a little later, you have a family of Kerala merchants who were clearly following a matrilineal pattern. And then later, interestingly, I'm sorry I couldn't make that slide. I couldn't prepare that slide properly. I had to delete it, where after they settled down in Karnataka, they actually shift to a patrilineal form of family organization. So you have evidence of matrilineal groups as well, where property passed from mother to daughter, and brothers may be managing it and passing it on to the nephew. So this kind of situation certainly existed in several parts of Karnataka. And it was not just coastal Karnataka, it was interior Karnataka as well. So in these ways, both by bilateral as well as matrilineal, women clearly had property rights. But apart from that, however, as I mentioned, Lokanatha Pandita, who was a Brahmin, you have women in his family being allowed inheritance. Similar to that, even where you have Brahmin groups, which follow a clearly patrilineal inheritance system, even there you occasionally have daughters being given, daughters and daughters' children being given land through influence, as a kind of gift. So that is done. So that is essentially because, again, as I said, the Dravidian kinship system keeps the brother sister, pairing very close. The cross cousin marriage is done through influence. So that is done. So here also give, so that is another feature that we find. So daughters therefore get land in a large number of ways, even in patriarchal families. Next one, sir. Thank you. So, and we can also see in many ways affinal relatives, meaning relatives by marriage, being very important. The relatives on the mother's side, relatives by marriage were extremely important, and that importance is repeatedly, brought various ways. So we have, for instance, uncles fighting for nephews. So there's an inscription from Madhuvina Kodi, I think. Chamarajnagar or thereabouts, Mysore or thereabouts, where nephews died fighting, and then the uncle, out of affection for them, took up their cause and also went into fight out of affection for his nephews. So that close bonding. So similarly, you also have other inscriptions. I don't remember the exact references, but you have a large number. One goes about looking, we can find it very easily, where daughters, where the mother's brother and the nephew are very closely linked to each other. They fight for each other. The nephews may fight for the uncle. Sometimes the the grandson will fight for the maternal grandfather. You can find out that that is the case because you have the grandfather-grandson relationship being mentioned, but the villages are different. So in all probability, that is a maternal relative, and the grandson fighting for the maternal grandfather. That kind of instances you find in a large number of inscriptions. Uncles taking up the cause of their nephews, or the nephews taking up the cause of the uncle. And if you recollect, in Ranna, for instance, when you have the description, that famous verse, where the various occasions for battle are mentioned. You have Ranna saying that when the king Erevesa, so when the king commands, you go out and fight. When your village is attacked, Uralivinal, when the cattle are raided, Turukodal, and when Nintaneder, when kinsmen cry out for help, then you fight. So these are the various occasions. So kinship was a very major factor in bringing out you know bringing forces together, making people uh, adhere to a cause. So kinship is a major. And if you recollect, even in Pampa, when you have the reference to how the battle lines were drawn between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, he mentions that they call on their old friends, they call on people with whom they had tributary relationships, and they call on people who are their relatives, Nenter. So these are the ways in which, so nentatana or final relationships or relationships of any other kind, apart from the dayadis, you have dayadis. In fact, in various ethnographic works, you have a reference that dayadis are actually the problematic relatives, because they share a right to your property, so they may question it and they may fight. But you then draw on your brothers-in-law, your cousins and your brothers-in-law for help. So there's a very close link, and this is brought out in the Deshabalamai in various works, uh, uh, in Karnataka as well, in Tamil Nadu as well, where relatives, the final relatives are actually very close bond exists between them. Also, you have in various parts of Karnataka, you have whole networks of final relatives holding power. So you'll have an overlord, a Mahamandaleshwara, and under him, he'll be holding a large unit, and under him, the smaller units will be held by his son and also by his nephew or son-in-law. So Aliya, as well as sons, are people, or Sodar Baba, they are all people who hold land under them. So there's a whole network of final relationships holding land, holding power at various levels of the hierarchy. So for instance, you have got Kalimarasa in the Nargund inscription. His son holds the Bedwala 300 unit, and his son's Sodar Baba, which would be his either his father's sister's son or his mother's brother's son, was holding a smaller unit under him. So you have Rudra Rasa. So you have, in this fashion, the son as well as the nephew of Kalimarasa holding, land under him, under his power. Another nephew, his wife was specified as his wife's brother, son, Dasimarasa, also held we're not told what position he held, what unit he held, but he certainly seemed to have held some kind of official position as a subordinate. So Dasimarasa was his wife's brother's son. So you've got relatives on both sides, being mentioned, who hold power at various ends. You also see that in the case of Hulla Chamupati, his brother Kantimaya is mentioned in an inscription, and he was associated both with his sons. So when the grant is being made, we are told he is accompanied by his wife, his sons were named, and his nephew, who was probably, though it's not specified, was probably his younger sister Dugale's son. So this is the kind of picture. So they're all affiliated. They're all in association with each other when a grant is being made. Similarly, under the Hoysalas, this was the Nargund inscription with the Chalukyas of Kalyani. But the Hoysalas also, you have the queens being drawn from the ranks of feudatories. So for instance, Shantala, her mother's family, as well as her father, were all officials or, feudatories under the Hoysalas themselves. So, and the whole genealogy is detailed in the Shravanbelgoda inscriptions. Similarly, the Queen of Ballala II, her brother, her father are mentioned holding land in the in Mysore district. I forget the place exactly, but there's a whole series of inscriptions in the period of Ballala II for about something like 30 or 40 years, where first the father, then the brother, and then Bamla herself are exercising local authority over that particular place. So in this manner, so you have how you can see how, the the brothers-in-law of the king. There's another queen called Rajala Devi, another queen of Vishnuvardhana, whose uncle, whose maternal uncle, also was a feudatory and who used his proximity to the royal family to acquire lands and make grants. So this is a manner in which power was held among relatives. In fact, several feudatories under the later Hoysalas, for instance, they also have the term Aliya, prefixed to their name, which probably means that they were the sons-in-law, the nephews or brothers-in-law of various kings who were in power. So this is a way in which power was held among relatives. So final relatives are therefore very important in the power structure of that period. And you also have this habit of inscriptions describing a person. just before the grant is made, the protagonist will be situated in terms of his parents. So he'll say such and such as son, the son of this individual, this man was so good, this woman was so good, married to this lady was such a sati, was such a good wife, and who had, who was working, who was serving such and such a king, who was the disciple of such and such a guru, was the nephew of such and such a person. So, in this way, the whole kin structure is given. So you know who are the important people for that individual. So that is another way. And genealogy is also, as I mentioned, the father, the habitually, while you have the father, son, that is one structure. Some inscriptions adhere to just that, just the agnatic, the male line being mentioned. But more often, the mother's names are also mentioned. It may start off with just the father's name, but from the second or the third generation, the wives will be mentioned also. And by the last generation, the wife and the children are mentioned. And occasionally the maternal uncle, especially if the maternal uncle held a very important position, he will be mentioned. So there's this family of Baligara, a member of the Ayavale Guild, who was settled in the time of Hoysala, one of the early Hoysalas. Then by the third or the fourth generation, they marry into the family of the this relationship is prominently mentioned, and the Tripala then rises to an important position. So it seems that this influence of the final relative was used to project them to a higher level, because they had been at the village level earlier, but now they emerge as a higher feudatory. So that is the manner in which uh, these genealogies show. So especially when the wife's natal families, their parents, their uncles are influential individuals, that relationship will be prominently mentioned. And you also have, in many cases, the succession of the daughter's line. So if in the case of the Gangas of Uddare, you have the whole genealogy being developed. Towards the end, you find in the close of the 12th century, uh, Ekkalarasa was the last of the male line, probably didn't have any male heirs. So then his sister and her children then inherit, and her sister's son, his sister's son, then actually, though she was married to a Kadamba, but her son, because he becomes an heir to the Uddare Gangas, he then takes on the Ganga titles. So this is one instance again where the succession shifts to the female line. So these are the various ways in which the relatives, the daughter's line, the mother's line, the sister's line are all specified. Sisters, husbands are also mentioned in some cases, particularly if they are important. Daughters-in-law and their families are mentioned if they are important. So in this manner, you have a very clear, accommodation of the relatives by marriage. They are very important for, and that is, as I said, because of the Dravidian kinship system. Next slide. Thank you. So now I come to patrilineal, joint, and nuclear family units. So patrilineal families. So in some cases, particularly among the Panchalas, the 5 groups of artisans, you have several inscriptions which would indicate that the transmission of property was strictly on male lines. So you have actually, in case of a male heir being absent, you have inscriptions specifying that it should then go to the brother rather than to the daughters. In case of daughters, one inscription does mention daughters, but unfortunately it's a fragmentary inscription, so we don't know what the daughters got. But there's a series of inscriptions, particularly from the Bangalore region, where the brother is posited as the residual heir in case the male line fails. So that does happen. And this is among a comparatively, not a very high status group, a comparatively middle level social status group. So patrilineal property, and you also have patrilineal transmission of property among Brahmins. Um, so these are the among the Brahmins as well as among the Shaiva, somewhere from the late 11th, early 12th centuries, you find the Jiyar, who were trustees of Shaiva temple properties. They tended to be, until then, we get an impression that they are celibate. But at least from the late 11th, early 12th centuries, they seem to be in family units. And these family units tend to be patrilineal in their transmission, even though, as I mentioned earlier, even among them, sometimes the daughters received, were often recognized as heirs, or they received some lands. They and their children received lands through influence, through their various connections. They procured lands for them. That happened, but primarily the property transmission was through the male line, primarily, and the daughters got comparatively a lesser share of the property. Inscriptions, the way they are, they show the family group, they tend to mention all the brothers. So, for instance, in the Marwanji inscription of the 12th century, I think Kadur district it is, where you have a Gaunda family mentioned, 3 sons of Bama Gaunda are mentioned. He has 3 sons. When his father is mentioned, he is mentioned, his wife is mentioned, and they have 3 sons. And the 3 sons, the 2 elder sons seem to have died already by the time this inscription was written. Their sons are mentioned. And then the youngest brother is mentioned, who then constructs a shrine in memory of his father, to which he made grants in his own right, to which then later we have other inscriptions where the elder brother's sons also make grants. Now here, there's a slight lack of clarity. Now the youngest son, he is the youngest. So it's not clear whether though he is the youngest brother of the 3 brothers, but since the elder brothers seem to have predeceased, it is possible that he may be the eldest male in a joint family, or it may be partitioned and he is giving lands out of his own, and that seems to be blown out by the fact that the 2 elder brothers children make separate grants to the same temple. So it may have been partitioned at the death of the father, and the elder brother's sons get their share, and the youngest brother and his family, conjugal family unit, are depicted as one unit, building the temple and making grants. So it's not very clear whether it is this youngest brother being the eldest male exercising rights as the family head, or it has been partitioned. I'm inclined to think it's been partitioned. It's not very clear in this case. But you do have other inscriptions. For instance, a Mughal inscription, I think also from Chikmagalur, where a father and 3 sons are seen, Adi Gowda and his 3 sons are seen making grants together. You have another inscription where you have 3 brothers and the 3 sons of the eldest brother being shown as a unit. There's a 4th brother, elder to all of these, who seems to be a separate unit, but these 3 brothers, as well as the sons of the eldest of these brothers, are then shown as a unit who together make grants, build a temple and make grants. So these 2 instances of the fathers and the sons acting together, as well as the brothers and the brothers' sons acting together, would seem to be classic joint family units. At least, even we don't know whether they lived together, whether they cohabited as a joint family, but they certainly managed the family property together. That we can definitely say. So you have this kind of, differential between them. So you may have partition units in a joint family, but it's difficult to say whether they cohabited or not, but we can say whether the family property was controlled jointly or not. That we can deduce from the inscription. So this is the kind of picture that we get. Next slides. So this is one family. I'm sorry it doesn't come out clearly. Uh, Problem of diacritical marks not coming out. So this is the Koravangla family. It was a Brahmin family, where again, as the custom is, you have the whole family being delineated. So it comes from the grandfather's generation. The inscriptions deal with the third, Govinda, Nakarna, Kalidasa, and Buchiraja. These are the four brothers. This generation that the inscriptions are primarily concerned with. There are several inscriptions on Kuruvangla which depicts this family. All of them give an identical genealogy. It starts with the grandfather, Govinda the first, who has two sons, Nagarudra and Madhyamaya. And we are concerned with the younger brother, Madhyamaya, and his wife Makave and her 4 children. By the time these inscriptions are done, are being made, Madhyamaya seems to have died. Makave seems to have a share of the property because she excavates a tank in that village. Now we have Govinda, Nakana, and Buchiraja, whose temples are situated in Kuruvangala. Kalidasa, who's the third brother, his inscription and his temple is located in somewhere in Tumkur, if I recollect rightly. I did find a reference to him, but it's not found in Koravangala per se. He may have given away his rights and taken it elsewhere. It's not clear. But these 3 brothers and their temples do exist there, of which only Buchiraja's temple is in good condition. Currently, the other 2 brothers' temples have fallen into disrepair, sadly. So, what this exercising, this seems to be a joint family which has been partitioned and each unit exists separately. They have a kind of corporate unity. There's a reference, in fact, there's a description that the brothers were all very affectionate, like Rama and his brothers. They lived in very close affection with each other. But each of them is shown making grand separately. So it would seem, and the mother also has her share apparently, because she uses her share to excavate a tank in the. So this is the picture that we get. So this is a very clear instance. Whereas in the earlier instance that I said, I wasn't sure whether the younger brother, the youngest brother, was then the eldest male, was the head of a joint family, or it had been partitioned. I thought partition, but I'm not sure. But here we can have no doubt that it has been partitioned, and these are nuclear units. And this kind of picture, in fact, seems to predominate in most cases. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So the other thing, oh sorry, the previous one. Thank you. So as I mentioned earlier, when you go to the grand portion of inscription, I mean, so far I've been dealing with the genealogy, the way the family is depicted in the descriptions. But now when we come to the grand portion, you have references to land being held either jointly or conjugally in various. I'm particularly looking at 2 inscriptions from no, 2 sets of inscriptions. One from Murtage in somewhere near Dharwad, and the other I think from Hiryu from one of the 3 districts that Dharwad was trifurcated into. So that is where Murtage comes from, and the other is Hiryu from Belur Taluk of Hassan district. So we have, 2 sets of, interestingly, it is in each case a set of merchant families constructing temples in various villages where they go and purchase land. So you have several families of Brahmanas mentioned in Murtage, which was an agrahara. So, and you also have lower down families. I'm not going into that at the moment. You've got families of various Brahmana landholders, which are being mentioned. And you've got both types, both joint family as well as conjugal family units. So you've got for conjugal family unit, you've got Bachar and his wife Komala Devi, who hold land conjugally, as a unit, and they sell part of their lands to Kaihana Kaihi Shetty's temple, to the sons of Kaihi Shetty for his temple. So this is one. This is a conjugal unit. This is a small nuclear unit. So this emerges. On the other hand, you've got several others also where similar individuals are mentioned, so conjugally, but sons of various who seem to hold land. So it's been partitioned probably between the sons, and the sons are variously selling their land to the family of Kaihi Shetty for endowing his temple. Uh, on the other hand, you've got one joint family mentioned. So you have Kaihana Galisasa and his father's younger brother was not mentioned, is Chikkaya, but they apparently held land in common because they together sell the land. So here it seems to be a jointly held property. Again, as I said, we have no way of knowing how the household was structured, but we definitely know that they held property in common. Whereas Bacharasa and his wife held was a nuclear family, held property conjugally. And you've got other individuals where the wife is not mentioned, but only the son. So probably after partition, the son of so and so is selling his share of land to for the temple to be endowed. So this is the picture you get from Murtagi. In similar fashion, the Hidur inscription, you have got families of Gaudas. And here again, these are Gauda landowners who seem to have been the initial landowners, similar to, as I mentioned, the present landholdings in Hungary. So they seem to be very similar in the sense that they held land and they held a complex of rights over the water, over what was known as the Teja Samya, Ashtabhoga Teja Samya in our inscriptions, where they held rights over common lands, they held rights over irrigation. It came with a complex of things. So, and land seems to have been held in common in joint families. It doesn't seem to have been partitioned. So we have at least two families of Gaudas selling land to this family of uh, Kerala merchants, where the person selling were a Gauda, his wife, his son's wife. In one case, the son's wife was a widow. So, but she was still a member of that family. And this, I don't know, I get a sense it was also a cohabiting unit, but one can't be sure. But they definitely held a property in common. So the consent, all these people are mentioned as the sellers. So the land was definitely, therefore, held in common. And they may have been joined cohabiting units as well. In another case, it was the son, the wife, and the father, the son, and the father, mother, and the son who were selling it jointly. In one case, it was son's wife, one son, and another son's widow who were holding land in common. So it would seem, therefore, that from these inscriptions, that among the Gaudas too, particularly where they were the dominant group in the village, where they were the initial settlers of the village or descendants of the settlers, they held land in one common unit, and which by the 13th century, because these inscriptions are from the late 12th, early 13th century, so they were beginning to be sold. So it becomes saleable, partible also probably, but they were being held in common even now, and they're being sold now. We are actually told that he had given a loan to them, and since they are unable to return the loan, they are giving him the land, which he then goes on to endow the temple with. So this is the kind of uh, pictures we get. And interestingly, the Kerala merchant who bought the property and endowed it on a temple, he had his son, who was a Shaiva Jangama, we are told, had died, predeceased him. And in his honor, he constructed the Kunjeshwara. His son's name was Kunjishetty, and in his name, he constructed the Kunjeshwara. And the property the property that was endowed on that temple, was then given to the daughter, the younger daughter, who was set up as the Ganakumari, which should be the female variant of the Sthanika of the temple. At least that's how the editors describe it. So she is the manager of this temple. And we find the similar kind of structure also in several other inscriptions of the 13th century or the early 14th, where families who are making grants then give their daughters or sons, very often in some 3 or 4 cases, I've found the daughter is then endowed with the managerial rights over it. So she actually controlled that temple property. So even though it was endowed on the temple, the daughter still retained rights. Some cases it was I think in one Brahmana family, the sons and the daughter got differential rights in that temple property that was endowed. The sons getting double of what the daughter got. It was a Brahmin family, so the manner in which. So if you consider the two brothers together, the sister got a quarter of what the two brothers jointly got. So that is the standard. Would say that was a normative, that was a norm, right? Where the daughters got 1/4 of what the brothers got in the Dharmashastric literature. It was a Brahmin family, a Brahmin feudatory family. So it makes it entirely fits in, but the daughter does get, and she gets land. That is important. I mean, whereas the Dharmashastras do not really envisage land as the property of women. It mostly suggests movable property, mostly gold. But in South India, we have several inscriptions where, both among Brahmins as well as non-Brahmins, daughters are given a share of their parents' property, and they exercise independent right over it. They are making independent grants of temple and grants of land, which they have inherited from their parents. Land belonged to the father, and then it is inherited by the daughter, and then the daughter. I remember seeing those instances. So you have, therefore, if one looks at all this in the light of all this, so you have wives inheriting lands as widows, which we have seen in the Kurvangla inscription, or in the land being held conjugally by the husband and the wife. You also have some inscriptions, Tamil inscriptions, particularly from the vicinity of Talakkad and other places, where Brahmanas wives are seen making grants to temples. Uh, so this, and it is, she's described as a wife, and then she's shown making an independent grant. So land held conjugally, you have wives holding land in their own rights, you have daughters being given land as managers of the temple or independently. Sometimes, as I mentioned, influence was used. The connections of the paternal family was used in order to endow the daughter and the daughter's children, or the son-in-law. Very often she was married to the nephew, so the relationship is even closer. So in these various ways, therefore, you can situate the women's rights of inheritance within these various next slide. uh, yeah, so this was the family I mentioned in the previous one, the Hiriur inscriptions, where you have the matrilineal structure. So you have Kunji Shetty and his sister. The sister is not named. Then you have the nephews and another sister. And then you've got another nephew and another sister. But in this case, the next generation, which unfortunately I was not able to, for um, my lack of expertise in cut and paste, I was not able to make the table, continue the table. In the next generation, very interestingly, this family shifts from a matrilineal to a patrilineal mode. So you have, the sister, his name is mentioned, I think it was Sovaka or something like that. Her husband is called Kakara Manawal. Their son, then, I think his name was Bandi Nambi Shetty. His wife is mentioned and his children are mentioned. So you have a shift in the next generation from from it being a purely matrilineal structure with the sister and the brothers, and the line continuing in the female line. You have that shifting to a patrilineal structure where the father, mother, and the children are mentioned. But again, the daughters are accommodated. So I mentioned how one daughter to whom the temple property was given as a man in a managerial capacity. She was given that. Another daughter, he purchases lands and gives it to her. So, the daughters get a lot of property from the father. He just purchased. So that obviously comes from the matrilineal mindset that they already have, even though the structure of the family may have changed because they're now settled in Karnataka, influenced by the surroundings. But that matrilineal mindset which had existed before, that comes in, and you have the daughters being endowed. So you have bilateral family inheritance, your matrilineal family inheritance, and even in patrilineal families, you have the daughters being given a share of property in through various means. The wives inheriting property, the daughters being given property, and this happens in most families where daughters are inherited. And so, therefore, because of that, whereas initially in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, the earliest women making grants are members of the royal family, the queens of the daughters-in-law of kings were making grants. But by the 11th, 12th centuries, you've got women from varying social strata making land grants. You also have, I forgot to mention that when I mentioned matrilineal, sorry, when you mentioned the matrilineal mode of transmission. Another group that was strictly matrilineal were the Devaditis, the female servants of temple, the courtesans attached to the temple, the sules attached to the temple. Their line is always mentioned, the mother, it comes in the mother-daughter line. It's only in the Hoysaleshwara temple inscriptions from Halebit that I've ever found a reference to Devaditi's father being mentioned. In almost every case, it was the other temple servants, the musicians who are mentioned as the fathers, but in most of the cases, it's only the mother-daughter line that is ever mentioned. And they also were endowed with property as members of the temple staff. They were assigned lands, they held lands, and they seem to have made grants to endow the temple in that land. So they were also another group which was matrilineal, which held property, both professional right from the professional side, as well as maybe from the matrilineal transmission. But they held land and they made land. Right? So varying groups of women we find making land grants by the 12th, 13th centuries. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to address.
Thank you, madam. It's a very wonderful presentation on early medieval society and particular kinship, the family structure. So, I request our honorable audience, scholars, anybody has any questions, please type. We have some questions, madam. I'll take up some questions. Some scholars have already. Madam, K. Gopal. K. Gopal, he has mentioned one question. Madam, your lecture is mainly focused on elite Hindu women and the law of inheritance prescribed by the Hindu text. What about the tribal women and their right of inheritance? This is the question by K. Gopal, madam.
Yeah, well, the thing is, because of inscriptions, I'm actually constrained by the fact that the inscriptions mostly mention the elite groups, not just the Brahmins, even other groups, but landholding groups primarily. But as I mentioned, the whole we do have matrilineal, being found among matrilineal and bilateral forms of inheritance, which probably existed even at the lower levels among tribal women also. I mean, it's a fair presumption because among many tribal groups, you have matrilineal transmission of property being mentioned. You also have, in some cases, among the Nadars, for instance, in Tamil Nadu, the Nattatti Nadars have a bilateral form of inheritance, similar to what was followed among the Jaffna Tamils. So you have that. And they are very often, these lower members of lower levels of social hierarchy, they don't come much. I mean, we are constrained by our sources, But I think it's a fair presumption that they were governed by, particularly in South India, by a more liberal um, rights of inheritance than the upper echelons of society, which were more tend to be more influenced by the Dharmashastric norms. Anything?
Madam, next observation by Bairegowda is he has put his words here like this. Certainly, madam, your discussion and your analysis of kinship and matrimonial relationship is concentrated more on the kingdoms and feudal hereditary hierarchy. It seems not more on laymen and their families' relationship patterns. Madam. This is a similar question which is a K.
No,
Gopal.
to the extent that we can make out at the lower levels also a similar, because many of the heroes who are mentioned as having died, right? Whenever you have a reference in Madhuvina Kodi, which I mentioned during my talk, it's a very significant thing that the heroes always mentioned in terms of their mothers. Their father may be named, but the mother is the one who is given primacy. So it would seem that it was a matrilineal kind of setup, and they don't seem to be very rich people. They seem to be drawn from among the commoners. They were not very rich people. So here again, a similar situation does exist where your matrilineal, where the uncles and nephew relationships are very significant, more significant than perhaps the father-son relationship. So that seems to exist. That is among the more among the what you called the lay people, among the lower strata of society.
Hello.
As a lowest level, you have, for instance, the Murtage inscriptions that I mentioned. You've got matrilineal families being mentioned who are given tenancy rights and particular, obligations to supply the temple. So you have matrilineal units again mentioned there. You've got mother as a woman, her sister, and the sister's son being mentioned as a unit. So this is again in a much humbler level of society. So there also, and in fact, to a greater degree, probably the final relatives and the matrilineal structure, the bilateral inheritance structure will be more marked lower we go in the hierarchy. It will be more liberal the lower we go. Among the upper, groups, there is a tendency to be patrilineal as far as possible. Of course, as I mentioned, the Panchalas were an exception. They seem to have been strictly patrilineal, even excluding daughters from, to the extent that I can make out, excluding daughters. Most other cases, however, you do have a reference to wherever small grants of land were made to heroes. There's a specification that Hennige Mula, that Dana Mula formula comes in several parts of Karnataka. You also have general reference that it will go in the to the children without specifying genders. So it's not clear whether it is male or female, but I am presuming that both children, both male and female, may have had rights. Yes.
Madam, Dr. Hemant Kadambi from Delhi, Shivnadar University, uh, he has put a chat box in the questions. Dear Madam, thank you for your presentation. Learned a lot. You had mentioned that women were entitled to movable property. Apart from the gold that you mentioned, what might be other sorts of movable wealth? I ask also from the point of archaeological artifacts that can be available for analysis that could help reconstruct such histories or corroborate what may be known from the inscriptions. So yes, put the questions other than gold, what are the other wealth, movable wealth can be shared to the matrimony women, madam? That is his question, madam.
Yeah, vessels, I presume, household effects. You do have an inscription, which is one of the most fascinating inscriptions I've seen, where it is mentioned that a woman, a lady who ruled a town, she was from a Vaishya background, Bananju Dharma. And she is specifically stated that she was not born to touch pots and pans. So I'm presuming that, you know, the vessels that we have were another form of wealth that was bestowed on the daughter. Other household effects may have also been given, like furniture, but we have no idea really. Also, slaves and families where, you know, the royal families, we have references to women being given, you know, daughters being given slave women to accompany them to their husband's family. So that's another form of movable wealth. And those ladies were also then, you know, subject to, and that comes in literature. We don't have so much reference in inscriptions. I never come across inscriptions mentioning. You have Toltuna Maga, the slave's son, who are also entitled to property to a much greater share than what the Dharmashastras were willing to accommodate them with. You do have that, but we have no clear idea how the Toltus were procured, whether it came as a woman's marital property or what, we don't know. We have references to that, but that is in literature. In Kannada literature, you have references to princesses, particularly being accompanied by a large number, and this was a practice that seems to have happened even up till the modern period, in, you know, the more uh, feudal areas of India. I remember seeing a Telugu movie many years ago in which a similar practice existed. A girl, when she comes in for marriage, brings in several servants who are then used as, you know, as concubines by the husband. But this also is another form. But I have no clear picture of that. I mean, that comes from literature. I've never found any clear inscriptional evidence for that. As far as archaeological evidence goes, I don't know for this period, for the period that I have dealt with, but if you look at burials in the megalithic period, I believe women are often found buried with vessels. You know? So I think that vessels, therefore, would be pots, pans, you know, pottery of various kinds. That would be one form of wealth, that movable wealth that, you know, they would be endowed with, apart from gold. Also landed property. I mean, like, whether unlike the Dharmashastras, which only envisage movable property, South India also gave them, very clearly gave them landed property, which they had independent rights over, which they controlled independently. In most cases, in one or two cases, of course, we do have a reference in an inscription where a mother is asking her children for permission to make land grants in her own name. So it may have been curtailed. I mean, that independence may have been curtailed, but in most inscriptions I've seen, the woman seems to have been doing it of her own free will. So that is one thing. But as far as movable wealth is concerned, it may have been slaves, definitely household effects, household property, you know, pans, vessels, may have been furniture too. I don't know.
Madam, in this group, Dr. Manu Devadevan sir is also with us. Sir, Manu Devan sir, if you have any questions, he has written recently on early medieval
it was a fascinating
history.
Yeah.
So I request Dr. Manu Devadevan. Sir, unmute and you can ask the question. Manu Devadevan sir.
Arunivare, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Malini, this was a fascinating talk. Thank you very much for this talk. I have a question. See, you mentioned that Vijnaneshwara is perhaps more liberal than Manu. And there is almost a gap of 900 or 1,000 years between the two of them. Now, most of the evidence that you discussed were from the 11th, 12th, 13th century, perhaps even 14th century. But when we come to the 7th, 8th, or 9th century, we do not actually see women in so many numbers making land grant or inheriting property. But when we go back to the last phase of the early historical period, Professor Kumkum, for instance, actually shown that Sanchi, in a place like Sanchi or in Barhut, there are a large number of women making grants to the Buddhist establishments. Of course, not land, but some or the other form of gift. Land grant was not a very popular practice in the first millennium BC, perhaps, but you do have that situation where women in large numbers are making grants, and you do have that again from, say, roughly the 10th, 11th century onwards. But in the 7th, 8th, and 9th century,
10th century itself.
Yeah. What happens in between is interesting for me, because in the 8th, 9th, or maybe from the 6th, 7th, 8th century, you do have, at least in Karnataka, a serious paucity of metallic coins, the famous R.S. Sharma thesis, you know. And I believe in it, at least for Karnataka, with due apologies to John Dale and others. So do you think money or the liquidity in the economy caused by money has some role to play in it? Because in the earlier period, when you do have monetization on a substantial scale, you find women making grants, and you see that again after the 10th century, from the time of, say, Attimabbe or so, women are more and more involved in inheriting property as well as making grants. So is the liquidity in the economy induced by money a causal factor?
It may have been one factor, because, as you mentioned, you have sales also coming into the picture once money becomes, land sales, land purchases coming into the work from around the 11th century once, coinage begins to circulate. So it may have been one factor, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure why it is that women have a very low presence. So from the 5th to the about 10th century, it is mostly only royal women making grants, queen mothers, queens, princesses who are making grants. So that they are assigned the distribution of fiefs among the royal family members, which holds at least in Karnataka till about the 8th century, 8th, 9th centuries. So as in that sense, they began making grants. And I think it's also interesting that most of the women who make grants usually make it to Jainas, more often to the Jainas than to the Brahminical establishment, at least in the early period. Most of the women making grants are Jainas, and they make grants to Jaina temples. They seem to have a distinct preference for it. But they seem to derive their rights from the fact that they are given parcels of land to rule, authority to rule over certain areas. And we don't have women of the lower strata of society being visible at all in the record. So yeah, it may have been a part of monetary lack of money may have been a factor. I haven't thought of that actually. Thanks for bringing that up. I hadn't really thought of it in those terms. But yeah, I think it may have been very significant. And because when we finally begin finding land grants in large numbers made by women of all strata, you also have, property. You also have land being purchased, land being sold for money. You have large coinages being mentioned. Your coinage being mentioned from around the 11th century. There's also when you begin having these courtesans making grants. So yeah, it may have been significant. As I said, thanks for telling me this, because I hadn't thought of it.
Yes, sir.
I don't know. I was just thinking loudly, but thank you very much.
Yeah, well, it may be a factor. It definitely may
have. Sir, Madam, Dr. Ashok Shetty is also in the Facebook. He's also watching, and also from Gulbarga, Dr. Riaz Ahmad Bode sir is also watching in the Facebook. A number of scholars, Dr. Ashwat Narayana, Sunkam Govardhan, many are there. So, sir, anybody would like to ask, please unmute and ask any questions. Lalita Madam is also there. Lalita Madam has worked on the same period of your work, Madam.
Okay, that'll be really interesting.
But on the various aspects of hero cults, yes, she has worked on that. Lalita Madam from Vijayanagara College.
Madam, namaskara.
Hello.
Namaskar.
Hello, I can hear you.
ನಾನು
ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.
ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಬೋದಾ?
ಹೇಳಿ ಹೇಳಿ ಮೇಡಮ್, ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳಿ.
ಹಾ
ಹೇಳಿ
ಮೇಡಮ್,
ಹೇಳಿ ಹೇಳಿ.
ಹಾ ಈಗ
ನಂಗೆ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಕಷ್ಟ ಆಗ್ತದೆ, ಬಿಟ್ರೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಸರಿ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತದೆ.
ಅವ್ರ ಕ್ವಶನ್ ದಲ್ಲಿ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳಿ ಮೇಡಮ್, ತೊಂದ್ರೆ ಇಲ್ಲ.
10-11ನೇ
ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ
ಶತಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ,
ಕೇಳಿ, ನಂಗೇನ್ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್.
ಓಕೆ, 10-11ನೇ
ಬಗ್ಗೆ
ಶತಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಶೇಷವಾದಂತ
ಹಾ.
ಮಹಿಳೆಯರ ದಾನದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರಿ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಪ್ರಾಪರ್ಟೀಸ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಹೇಳುವಾಗ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಈ ಕಾಳಾಮುಖ ದೇವಾಲಯಗಳು, ಕಾಳಾಮುಖ ಮಠಗಳು ಇತ್ಯಾದಿಗಳು ನಿಧಾನವಾಗಿ ಈ ಒಂದು
ಹಾ.
ನೈಷ್ಠಿಕ ಬ್ರಹ್ಮಚಾರಿಗಳು ಅದರ ಒಂದು ಹೆಡ್ಸ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದದ್ದು ನಿಧಾನ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಗ್ತಾ, ಅವರ ಸ್ವಂತ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಅದರ ಒಂದು ಮಠದ ಒಂದು ಆಧಿಪತ್ಯ ಹೋಗುವಂತ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಅನೇಕ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರಿಗೆ, ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಕಾಳಾಮುಖ ಮಠಗಳ ಮತ್ತೆ ದೇವಾಲಯಗಳ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತದ್ದ ಜಿಯರ ಮಕ್ಕಳಲ್ಲಿ ಆಸ್ತಿ ಡಿವೈಡ್ ಆಗುವ ಸಂದರ್ಭಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಈ ಜಿಯರ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಆಸ್ತಿ ಹಂಚಿಕೆ ಆಗಿರೋದ್ರ ಬಗೆಗೆ ತುಂಬಾ ಕಂಡು ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಏಕೆ ನನ್ನ ಅಧ್ಯಯನದ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವ ಅರಸೀಕೆರೆ ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಕಾಳಾಮುಖ ಏರಿಯಾಸ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀವೋ, ನಮ್ಗದು ಆರಂಭದಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ನೈಷ್ಠಿಕ ಬ್ರಹ್ಮಚಾರಿಗಳಾಗಿದ್ರಿಂದ ಶಿಷ್ಯರುಗಳಿಗೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಿತ್ತು. ಅನಂತರದಲ್ಲಿ ಅದು ಕುಟುಂಬದಲ್ಲಿ ಹಂಚಿಕೆ ಆಗುವಾಗ
ಕುಟುಂಬ ಶಿಫ್ಟ್ ಆಗ್ತದೆ. ಅದು ನೈಷ್ಠಿಕತನದಿಂದ ಮನೆತನಕ್ಕೆ ಅದು ಶಿಫ್ಟ್ ಆಗುದು. ನಾವು 11ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದ ಕೊನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ 12ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡ್ತೇವೆ.
ಶಿಫ್ಟ್ ಆದ ನಂತರದಲ್ಲಿ ಅನೇಕ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಈಗ ವಿಧವೆ ತಾಯಿಗೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ, ಅಳಿಯಂದ್ರಿಗೆ ಹಾಗೆ ಮಗನಿಗೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಭಿನ್ನವಾಗಿ ಇಂಥದ್ದೊಂದು ವ್ಯಾಜ್ಯಗಳೆಲ್ಲ ಬಂದಾಗ ಅದು ನಿವಾರಣೆ ಮಾಡಿರುವಂತದ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ಉದಾಹರಣೆಗಳಿದೆ. ಸೊ ಈ ತರಹದ ಒಂದು ಬಹಳ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಆಸ್ತಿಯ ಹಂಚಿಕೆ 12th ಸೆಂಚುರಿ ಆನ್ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ಅದು ಹಕ್ಕು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳು ಕೇಳೋಕ್ ಶುರು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಕಂಡು ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು, ನಮ್ಗೆ ಹಲಕೂರಿನ ಒಂದು ಶಾಸನದೊಳಗೆ ಒಂದು ಗೌಡಿಕೆಯ ಹಂಚಿಕೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸಂಪತ್ತಿನ ಹಂಚಿಕೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ತನ್ನ ಗಂಡ ಸತ್ತ ನಂತರ ದಾಯಾದಿಗಳು ಬಿಡದೇ ಇದ್ದಾಗ ಆಕೆ ಇಡೀ ಒಂದು 8 ಹಿಟ್ಟು ಮುಂತಾದಂತಹ ಅನೇಕ ಸಂಘಗಳನ್ನ ಸೇರಿಸಿ ಪಂಚಾಯಿತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅವಳು ಹೆಣ್ಣಿಂಗೂ, ಗೌಡನ ಹೆಣ್ಣಿಂಗೂ ಸಲ್ಲುವುದು ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಹೊಸ ತೀರ್ಮಾನವನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿಸ್ತಾಳೆ. ಸೊ ಈ ತರ ನಮ್ಗೆ 12th ಆನ್ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳು ತಮ್ಮ ಹಕ್ಕನ್ನ ಚಲಾಯಿಸಿದ್ದು ಕೂಡ ಕಂಡು ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಆ ತರದ್ದೇನಾದ್ರೂ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಹತ್ರ ಮತ್ತಷ್ಟು ಮಾಹಿತಿ ಇದ್ರೆ ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ತಿಳಿಸಿ.
ಸುಮಾರಿದೆ. ಇನ್ಫ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ ನಾನು ಮೆನ್ಷನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೆ, ಅದು ಇನಿಷಿಯಲಿ ಅದು ಹಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಎಣಿಸೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಶುರುವಾಗುವಾಗ ಗಂಡು ಮಕ್ಳಿಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಾಗಿದೆ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಕೆಲವೊಮ್ಮೆ ಅಳಿಯಂದ್ರಿಗೆ ಮದುವೆ ಮಾಡಿ ಕೊಡುವಾಗ ಮತ್ತೆ ಅಳಿಯ ಮತ್ತೆ ಮಗಳಿಗೆ ಆಸ್ತಿಯನ್ನು ಕೊಡುದು ಯಾವ್ದೊಂದು ಶಾಸನದಲ್ಲಿದೆ. ದಟ್ಸ್ ಒನ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಅರ್ಲಿಯೆಸ್ಟ್ ಒನ್ಸ್, ಐ ಥಿಂಕ್ 11ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದ ಕೊನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬರುವಂತದ್ದು. ಆ ನಂತರ ಸುಮಾರು ಕಡೆ ಅದು ಹಂಚಿಕೆ ಆಗುದು, ಜಿಯರ ಇದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಹಂಚಿಕೆ ಆಗುದು. ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಒಂದು ಪಾಲು ಹೋಗುದು, ವಿಧವೆಗೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಪಾಲು, ಗಂಡು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಮತ್ತೆ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೂ ಅಂತ ಬರ್ತದೆ. ಬಟ್ ಒನ್ ಥಿಂಗ್ ಐವ್ ಸೀನ್, ನಾನು ಒಂದು ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ನೋಡಿದಂದ್ರೆ ಕಾಲಮುಖರಕ್ಕಿಂತಲೂ ವೀರಶೈವರು ಬರುವಾಗ, ವೀರಶೈವರಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬಾ ಪ್ರಬಲವಾಗಿ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಸಿಕ್ಕುವಂತದನ್ನ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಈವನ್ ಮೋರ್ ದನ್ ಅಮಾಂಗ್ ದ ಕಾಲಮುಖರಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಪ್ರಬಲವಾಗಿ ವೀರಶೈವದ ಯಾವ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ನಾನು ಶಾಸನವನ್ನು ನೋಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ, ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾಗಿ ಒಂದು ಸಿಕ್ಕುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಟಿಪ್ಯುಲೇಷನ್ ನಾನು ನೋಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ ಹೆಚ್ಚಿನ ಇನ್ಸ್ಕ್ರಿಪ್ಷನ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ. ಸೊ ಮಕ್ಕಳಲ್ಲಿ ಮಗಳಂದ್ರಿಗೆ ಸಹಭಾಗಿತ್ವವನ್ನ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮಗಳಂದ್ರು ಅದು ಮತ್ತೆ ಇವರಿಗೆ ಶಿಷ್ಯರಿಗೂ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ ಅವರು. ಬಟ್ ಸೊ ಅದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಲಿಬ್ರಲ್ ಆಗಿ ನಾನು ನೋಡಿದಂದ್ರೆ ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕ ಪಂಗಡಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡುವಾಗ ಎಲ್ಲಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಲಿಬ್ರಲ್ ಆಗಿ ಇರುವುದು ನನ್ನ ಮನಸ್ಸಿಗೆ ಅದು ವೀರಶೈವರೇ ಅಂತ. ವೀರಶೈವರಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದಷ್ಟು ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಕೊಡುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಅಧಿಕಾರದ ಒಂದು ಕಲ್ಪನೆ ಬೇರೆ ಯಾವ ಗ್ರೂಪಲ್ಲಿ ಅಷ್ಟರ ಮಟ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಸಿಕ್ಕುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಪ್ರಬಲವಾಗಿ ಅದು ಬರ್ತದ. 13ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತೂ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಎಲ್ಲಾ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ, ಯಾವ್ದಾ ಒಂದು ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಒಳ್ಳೆ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರನ್ನ ಒಂದು ಎಂಡವ್ ಮಾಡುವುದನ್ನ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ತೇವೆ. ಅವರು ಅದನ್ನ ಅವರ ಅಧಿಕಾರವನ್ನು ಚಲಾಯಿಸುವಂತದ್ದು ನೋಡಿದ್ದೇವೆ ನಾವು. ಹಲ್ಕೂರಿನ ಐ ಥಿಂಕ್ ಐ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಸೀನ್ ದ ಡಿಸ್ಕ್ರಿಪ್ಷನ್, ಬಟ್ when I was making this presentation, I was like, beset with so much wealth of evidence that I left out a great deal which I needed to bring in. So ಅದ್ರಲ್ಲಾಗಿ ಅದು ಬಿಟ್ಟು, ಬಟ್ ಹೌದು ನಾನು ನೋಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ ಆ ಇನ್ಸ್ಕ್ರಿಪ್ಷನ್, ಮತ್ತೆ ಅದು ತುಂಬಾ ಪ್ರಬಲವಾಗಿ ಬಂದಿದೆ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಗೌಡಿಕೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಸಹ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾಗಿ ಎಷ್ಟೋ ಕಡೆ ಯಾವುದೋ ಒಂದು ನಂಗೆ ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತ ಈಗ ನೆನಪಾಗುದಿಲ್ಲ, ಯಾವುದೋ ಒಂದು ಇದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಗೌಡ್ರ ಮಗಳಂದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಮಗಳಿಗೆ ಎಸ್ಪೆಷಲಿ ಹಿರಿಯ ಮಗಳೇನ ಅವಳಿಗೆ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಶಾರನ್ನ ಕೊಡುವಂಥದ್ದು ಅನ್ಸ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ತೇವೆ. ಈಗ ನನ್ಗೆ ನೆನಪು ರಿಮೆಂಬರ್ that there was an inscription where the man specified that his daughter, the eldest daughter, was to receive a larger share than the other children, all other children. So that also we have seen. So ಅದೊಂದು ಇದೆ. ಅದು ಸೊ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳ ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ಸ್ತರದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಅಧಿಕಾರವನ್ನು ಕೊಡುವಂಥದ್ದು, ಭೂಮಿಯನ್ನ ಕೊಡುವಂಥದ್ದು, ಭೂಮಿ ಮೇಲೆ ಸ್ವರುಚಿಯಾಗಿ ಅವರು ಅದನ್ನ ಡೀಲ್ ಮಾಡುದನ್ನ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ತೇವೆ. ಅದು ಪ್ರಬಲವಾಗಿ 12ನೇ 13ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಬರ್ತದೆ. ಬಟ್ 11ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ
ಹಲೋ ಮ್ಯಾಮ್, ಈಗ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಅರಿಶಿಣ ಕುಂಕುಮವಾಗಿ ಕೊಡುವಂಥದ್ದು ಅಂತ ಒಂದು ಪದ್ಧತಿ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣರಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಕಂಡುಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಅರಿಶಿಣ ಕುಂಕುಮದ ಹೊಲ, ಅರಿಶಿಣ ಕೊಟ್ಟಂತ ಒಂದು ಹಸು, ಅರಿಶಿಣ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಶೃಂಗೇರಿ ಮಠ ಇತರ ಮಠಗಳ ಕೆಲವು ದಾಖಲೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಅವರ ಗಂಡಂದಿರ ಸಾವಾದ ಸಂದರ್ಭಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ನನ್ನ ತಂದೆಯ ಮನೆಯಿಂದ ಅರಿಶಿಣ ಕುಂಕುಮಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ನನಗೆ ಬಂದಂತ ಇಂಥ ಒಂದು ಹೊಲವನ್ನ ನಾನು ಸ್ವ ಇಚ್ಛೆಯಿಂದ ಕಂಠ ಮುಟ್ಟಿ ಬರೆಸಿ ಇಂಥವರಿಗೆ ಇದನ್ನ ಕ್ರಯ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ ಅಥವಾ ದಾನ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀನಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಅದೇ ತರಹ ನನಗೆ ಬಂದಂತ ನಮ್ಮ ಆಸ್ತಿ ಏನಿದೆ ಅದನ್ನ ನನ್ಗೆ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಲ್ದೇ ಇರೋದ್ರಿಂದ ನಾನು ಇದನ್ನ ದತ್ತು ತಗೊಳ್ಳೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಅವಕಾಶ ಕೊಡಿ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳಿರೋದು, ಸಿಗದೇ ಇದ್ದ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಆ ಒಂದು ಆಸ್ತಿ ಇತ್ಯಾದಿಗಳನ್ನ ನೋಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದಿಕ್ಕೆ ಮೈದನ ಅದರ ವಾರಿಸುದಾರನಾಗಿರ್ತಾನೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಕೆಲವು ಸತಿ ತಮ್ಮ ಗಂಡಂದ್ರಿಗೆ ಮಠದ ಕಡೆಯಿಂದ ಯಾವುದೋ ಒಂದು ಪೂಜೆ ಇತ್ಯಾದಿಗಳನ್ನ ಮಾಡೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಾಗಿತ್ತೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟ ಉಪಾಧಿಗಳನ್ನ ಗಂಡಂದಿರ ಸಾವಿನ ನಂತರ ರಾಜೀನಾಮೆ ಪತ್ರವನ್ನ ಬರೆದು ಕೊಟ್ಟು ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ನನ್ಗೆ ಇನ್ ಮುಂದೆ ಸಂಬಂಧ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಬರಿಬೇಕಾಗ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಸೊ ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಆಸ್ತಿ, ಗಂಡನ ಆಸ್ತಿ ಆಟೋಮೆಟಿಕ್ ಆಗಿ ಹೆಂಡತಿಗೆ ಬರುವಂತದ್ದು ಇತ್ಯಾದಿಗಳು ಇರ್ಲಿಲ್ವಾ ಅನ್ನೋದೊಂದು 18-19ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದ ಕೆಲವು ದಾಖಲೆಗಳು, ರಾಜೀನಾಮೆ ಪತ್ರ ಬರೆಸಿರುವಂತಹ ಸುಮಾರು 25-30 ದಾಖಲೆಗಳನ್ನ ನಾನು ಇದ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಈ ಆರ್ಥಿಕ ಅಧಿಕಾರ ಮತ್ತು ಮಹಿಳೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಲೇಖನದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ನೋಡ್ತೇನೆ. ಬಹಳ ಒಂದು ತಂದೆಯಿಂದ ಬಂದದ್ದನ್ನ ಅರಿಶಿಣ ಕುಂಕುಮದನ್ನ ಮಾತ್ರ ಕೊಡುವುದಕ್ಕೆ ಅವಳಿಗೆ ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಹಕ್ಕಿತ್ತು ಅಂತ ನನಗ್ ಅನ್ಸತ್ತೆ. ಈ ಸ್ತ್ರೀಧನದ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಅರಿಶಿಣ ಕುಂಕುಮಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಬಂದ ಹೊಲ ಅಥವಾ ತೋಟಗಳನ್ನ, ಅದ್ರ ಬಗೆಗೆ ಏನಾದ್ರೂ ಮತ್ತಷ್ಟು ಮಾಹಿತಿ ತಮ್ಮ ಕಡೆ ಇದ್ರೆ ಹೇಳಲಿಕ್ಕೆ?
ಅಲ್ಲ, ನಾನ್ ನೋಡ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ ಮೇಡಮ್. ಅದು ನಾನು ಮಸ್ಟ್ ಬಿ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಅ ಲೇಟರ್ ಪೀರಿಯಡ್, ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ನನ್ಗೆ ಅದು ನೋಡಿದ ನೆನಪೇ ಆಗುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಕಡೆ ಐ ಥಿಂಕ್ ಅದು ವಿಜಯನಗರ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ಅದ್ರ ನಂತರ ಇರ್ಬೋದು. ನಾನ್ ನೋಡ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಅರಿಶಿಣ ಕುಂಕುಮ. ಬಟ್ ಐ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಸೀನ್ ಅ ರೆಫರೆನ್ಸ್. ಯಾವುದೋ ಒಂದು ಆರ್ಟಿಕಲ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇತ್ತು, ಟರ್ಮರಿಕ್ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಅಂತ ನೋಡಿದೆ ನಾನು ರೆಫರೆನ್ಸ್. ನನ್ನ ಇನ್ಸ್ಕ್ರಿಪ್ಷನ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವ್ದ್ರಲ್ಲಿಯೂ ನಂಗೆ ನೋಡಿದ್ ನೆನಪಾಗುದಿಲ್ಲ ನನ್ಗೆ. ಅದು ಅನದರ್ ಥಿಂಗ್ ವಾಸ್, ನಾನು ಎಲ್ಲೇ ಓದಿದ್ದೇನೆ, ಐ ಆಮ್ ನಾಟ್ ಶೋರ್, ಬಟ್ ಅದು ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷರ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಹೆಂಗಸ್ರ ಅಧಿಕಾರವನ್ನ, because they were very influenced by the ಧರ್ಮಶಾಸ್ತ್ರಿಕ್ codes, they considered that ಧರ್ಮಶಾಸ್ತ್ರದಿಂದವೇ ಸಮಾಜ ನಡೀತದೆ. ಅದನ್ನ ಅವರು ಅದು ಕೋರ್ಟಿಗೆ ಹೋದ ನಂತರ ಅದು ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಮಾಣ, ಅದೊಂದು ಮುಖ್ಯ ಅವರದ್ದು ಒಂದು ಆ ಚೌಕಟ್ಟಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಅದನ್ನು ನೋಡೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಹೆಂಗಸ್ರ ಅಧಿಕಾರ ಯಾವುದು ಕಸ್ಟಮರಿ ಆಗಿ ಬರುವಂತದ್ದು ಅದು ನಂತರದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊಲೋನಿಯಲ್ ಪೀರಿಯಡ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅದು ಕಮ್ಮಿ ಆಗಿದೆ ಅಂತ ಸಹ ನಾನು ಓದಿದ್ದೇನೆ ನಾನು. ಸೊ ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಅದು ರಾಜೀನಾಮೆ ಬರ್ಸ್ತು ಅದೆಲ್ಲ ಇರ್ಬೋದು ಅಂತ ಎಣಿಸ್ತದೆ. ಬಟ್ ಐ ಆಮ್ ನಾಟ್ ಶೂರ್, ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಐ ಹ್ಯಾವನ್ಟ್ ಸೀನ್ ದಿಸ್ ಅಟ್ ಆಲ್. ನಂಗೆ ಅದು
it is there madam, it is there actually, there are many rajina, it is there, yes.
ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಲಲಿತಾ ಮೇಡಮ್ ಅವರೇ.
ಇಲ್ಲ, ನಾನು ನೋಡಿಲ್ಲ
ಸರ್. ಮೇಡಮ್, ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಕಾಡಂಬಿ ಅವರು ಮತ್ತೆ ಅದನ್ನೇ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಸಣ್ಣ ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಕೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಮೇಡಮ್. ಅವರು ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯುವರ್ ಆನ್ಸರ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ಈ ಮೆನ್ಷನ್ ದಟ್ ಐ ಡಿಡ್ ನಾಟ್ ನೋ ವಾಟ್ ದಟ್ ವುಮೆನ್ ಕುಡ್ ಬಿ ಅಕಂಪೇನ್ಡ್ ಬೈ ಸ್ಲೇವ್ ವುಮೆನ್ ಟು, ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅವ್ರ ವುಮೆನ್ ಸ್ಲೇವ್ ವುಮೆನ್ಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಪ್ರಾಪರ್ಟಿ ತಗೊಂಡೋಗಿದ್ರು ಅಂತ ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಅವ್ರು ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ.
ಅದು ಶಾಸನದಲ್ಲಿ ಬರುದಿಲ್ಲ. It doesn't come in inscriptions, it comes in literary works. So most of the Jaina literary works, if you read, for instance, I remember there's a story in Shanti Purana, Punna's Shanti Purana, where, you know, two brothers are fighting over a girl who was given in accompaniment with the elder brother's wife. ಸೊ ಅದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಒಂದು ರೆಫರೆನ್ಸ್ ಬರ್ತದೆ. ಅಂಥದ್ದು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ಲಿ even ಪದ್ಮಭಾರತದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಹ ನಂಗೆ ನೆನಪಿದ್ದಾಗೆ ದ್ರೌಪದಿ ಮದುವೆ ಆಗಿ ಬರುವಾಗ ಅವಳ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಸುಮಾರು ಹೆಂಗಸರನ್ನ ಇದಾಗಿ ಕಳಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಬರ್ತದೆ. ಸೊ ಇನ್ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬರ್ತದೆ, ಇನ್ಸ್ಕ್ರಿಪ್ಷನ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ನೋಡ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ ಇಷ್ಟವರೆಗೆ. ತೊತ್ತಿಗೆ ರೆಫರೆನ್ಸ್ ಇದೆ, ಬಟ್ ಅದು ತೊತ್ತು ಎಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಬಂತು, ಎಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿತ್ತು ಅದು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಅದು ಪರ್ಚೇಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ ಅಥವಾ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಆನುವಂಶಿಕವಾಗಿ ಕೆಲವು ಕೆಲಸದವರ ಮನೆಗಳವರನ್ನ ಅವರು ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ರ, ಅದು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಅದು ಸರ್ಫ್ಡಮ್ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ರೆ ಅದ್ರಿಂದ ಮೂಲಕ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದ ಎಂತಂತ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಪರ್ಚೇಸ್ ಸೇಲ್ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುದಿಲ್ಲ, ಅಥವಾ ಅದನ್ನ ಅವರು ಮದ್ವೆ ಮಾಡುವಾಗ ಕೊಟ್ಟದ ಎಂತ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಇನ್ಸ್ಕ್ರಿಪ್ಷನ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬರುದೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಇನ್ಸ್ಕ್ರಿಪ್ಷನ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ತೊತ್ತಿಗೆ ರೆಫರೆನ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಬಂತು ಅಂತ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಹಾಗೆ
one second madam, I just so you know sir, I request in this also, in this group madam, Dr. Govardhan is also with us. Just two days back he has been awarded doctorate award as bestowed to him.
Congratulations.
So congratulations to Govardhan ಅವರೇ. ತಮ್ದು ಏನಾದ್ರು ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಇದ್ರೆ ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು, ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಈ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ವರ್ಕ್ಡ್ ಆನ್ ನೊಳಂಬಾಸ್.
ಓಕೆ,
ಗೋವರ್ಧನ್ ಅವರೇ.
ಸರ್ ಹೇಳಿ ಸರ್.
ಏನ ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಕೇಳಿ ಸರ್. PhD ತುಮಕೂರು ವಿಶ್ವವಿದ್ಯಾಲಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಮೇಡಮ್. ನಿನ್ನೆ ತಾನೇನೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ PhD ಅವಾರ್ಡ್ ಆಗಿದೆ ಮೇಡಮ್.
ಓಕೆ, ಐ ಲೈಕ್ ಟು ಸೀ ಇಟ್. ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಬೇಗ.
ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ ಮೇಡಮ್. ಮೇಡಮ್, ಈ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ಮತ್ತು ಆರ್ಥಿಕ ಚರಿತ್ರೆ ನೆಲೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ 4th ವಾಲ್ಯೂಮ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಆರ್ಟಿಕಲ್ ಇದೆ, ಅದರಲ್ಲೇ ನನ್ನೊಂದು ಆರ್ಟಿಕಲ್ ಇದೆ. ಮಹಿಳೆಯರ ಸ್ಥಾನಮಾನ ಹಾಗೂ ಬದಲಾವಣೆಗಳು, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ 7ರಿಂದ 13ನೇ ಶತಮಾನ ಅಂತ. ಲಲಿತಾಂಬ ಮೇಡಮ್ ಅವ್ರು ಏನ್ ಉಲ್ಲೇಖ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ಅದು ಬಹುತೇಕ 18-19ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದ ಮಠದ ದಾಖಲೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಇರುವಂತದ್ದು. ಶಾಸನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಆದ ರೀತಿಯ ರಾಜೀನಾಮೆ ಆಗ್ಲಿ, ಅರಿಶಿಣ ಕುಂಕುಮದ ಭೂಮಿ ದಾನದ್ದು ಉಲ್ಲೇಖಗಳು ಕಡಿಮೆ ಇದೆ. ಅದು ಸಾಮಾನ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಮಠದ ದಾಖಲೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣರಿಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿರಬಹುದು. ಆದ್ರೆ ನನಗೇನು ವಿಶೇಷವಾದ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಏನಿರ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ ಮೇಡಮ್ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ. ಐ ಲೈಕ್ ಯುವರ್ ಥಾಟ್. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಮ್ಯಾಮ್.
ವೆಲ್ಕಮ್. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ವೆರಿ ಮಚ್.
ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಮ್ಯಾಮ್.
ಗೋವರ್ಧನ್ ಅವರೇ, ಕಂಗ್ರಾಚುಲೇಷನ್ ಸರ್.
ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಸರ್.
ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಸರ್, ನಮಗೆ ನೋಡ್ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ.
ಓಕೆ ಸರ್. ಓಕೆ ಮ್ಯಾಮ್, ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಮ್ಯಾಮ್.
ಸರ್, ಮತ್ತೆ ಯಾರ್ದಾದ್ರು ಕ್ವಶನ್ಗಳಿದ್ರೆ ಕೊನೆಯ ಕ್ವಶನ್ಗಳಿಗೆ ಅವಕಾಶ. ಪ್ರದೀಪ್ ಕುಮಾರ್ ಶೆಟ್ಟಿ ಅವರು ಸರ್ ನಮ್ಮ ಜೊತೆಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದರ್ವೈಸ್ ವಿ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ವೈಂಡ್ ಅಪ್. Madam, I would like to share my thoughts, madam. It is a really wonderful. You know, we have analyzed so many inscription and also literature of the early medieval period up to 12th century, early 12th century. So, but my small observation is the Rashtrakuta inscriptions as well as the early Chalukya inscriptions, not much I have not come across, but you have referred mostly on Ganga and Vaisala inscriptions. Are they also Rashtrakuta inscription also refer to these kind of various aspects, madam?
Yeah, they do, but you know, the references, because I concentrated on family and kinship, more information comes from the post 10th century. For the previous period, as I mentioned, we only get essentially the royal family. You know, we don't get much information about people at the lower levels of society. So that's why I concentrated more on the later period, apart from the fact that southern Karnataka is what I'm more familiar with. than the than Northern Karnataka. Comparatively, nange idra mele hold ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಇದೆ, ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಗಂಗರ ಮತ್ತೆ ಹೊಯ್ಸಳರ ಮೇಲೆ ಮಾಡಿದೆ. But I have worked, of course, on Northern Karnataka also. I have tried to bring that in, but because where the form of inscriptions is concerned, it's a common thing. It becomes a kind of regional
variations
pattern. There's not much structure, and the Hoysala inscriptions sadhana ಒಂದೇ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೆ, ಒಂದೇ ರೀತಿಯ ಭಾಷೆ, ಒಂದೇ ರೀತಿಯ ಉಪಮೆಗಳನ್ನ ಏನು ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ ಅದೆಲ್ಲ ಒಂದೇ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೆ. But since I have I don't know, right from my PhD period, I think I'm more concentrating on Southern Karnataka.
Okay, madam, one more add-on question, madam. This the similar work has been on the Kakatiyas by Talbot scholar, French scholar. What is the difference between your work and her work, madam? She also took epigraphical sources as a major study.
No, actually, I've been very influenced by her work, actually, because she raises many questions. Particularly, she raises the whole issue of how far, the Dharma Shastras were influential, whether that was, so that also has influenced me greatly. I mean, I'm sorry I didn't take it up when I was dealing with it. There's also Leslie Orr and her work on the temple women of Tamil Nadu, which has also been I found very interesting. So I think the situations are parallel in most areas of the South. If you look at the situation in Karnataka or Andhra or Tamil Nadu in roughly the same period, I think similar developments took place generally. There may have been minor differences in the regional customs in the particular areas. Customary rules of inheritance were very important. I mean, more than underlines very often. Study of temple women, that temple women in Tamil Nadu, she says, don't get assigned land. They don't have very clearly defined rules. Now that is different from Karnataka, because Karnataka temple women are very clear. There are very clear roles in the temple ritual. They also are assigned lands. They are highly influential individuals. So that little difference does exist. But otherwise, we can see roughly similar patterns in inheritance and customs, family structure. But I remember Professor Subbarayalu, when once I mentioned the nuclear families, probably, you do have partition as the primary mode, which is what the Mitaksara also recognizes. And he said that, that is an impression that he also had from his sources for most family units, being conjugal units. So I think things are parallel in most areas in terms of inheritance and inheritance and women's rights. I think it's fairly parallel in the major areas of the South.
So thank you, madam. So nice. Various aspects of early medieval society has been touched upon. So with this, we'll end. I would like to thank all the gathered audience, various scholars, very reputed scholars. They have joined here today. So on the behalf of Rutumana and behalf of Itihas Darpana and Bangalore Historians Group, I thank all the audience, as also today's speaker, Dr. Malini madam. Excellent presentation, madam. Your
Thank
work
you
on
for giving me the opportunity.
No, it is our pleasure, madam. So nice of you, and we thank all of you. And once again, I thank Dr. Pradeep as well as the Dr. Rajesh as Nitesh helping me to today. I am hosting this program. So once again, I thank all of you. Thank you very much. We'll close the session. Thank you, madam.